We are celebrating 35 years of being on the Auraria campus. It's a huge milestone for us. And so thank you so much for being here today. GITA, in short, is a hub for transformative education, programming, and advocacy on issues of gender, equity, and social inclusion. We do have a physical space in the Boulder Creek building right behind the Auraria Colfax light rail station. And in non-pandemic times, we are open Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. I'm going to go ahead and move this along and share a little bit with you about kind of some of the upcoming events and programs that we are offering at GITA. Next Wednesday, we're going to be having a discussion on The Invisible Man, the 2020 release remake of the 1941 or 36 original, in honor also of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I'm going to be sharing quite a bit of information and student staff as well. So at the very end, we'll let you know all the ways that you can tune in, attend, register, and get to know us a little bit better. So students of Auraria are eligible for a free movie voucher to watch The Invisible Man ahead of time, in addition to picking up a complimentary snack pack at the C Film Center, one of the only nonprofit movie theaters in Denver, and the last standing theater with the capability of showing 35 millimeter film. So they have generously offered complimentary snack packs to students of Auraria. You can register, get your movie voucher, have some popcorn and snacks, and then join us for our discussion. I'm going to invite Julissa to hop on in here and share about the book club.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see so many people here. It's very, very exciting. So I'm glad that you're all here. So for the book club for this month, it's going to be on the 29th, and we're going to be discussing In the Dream House by Carmen Machado. If you don't know what this book is about, it's an innovative and sort of interesting trope-based nonfiction novel account. You can see I do very well with people and things like this. Anyway, it's a nonfiction memoir about Carmen Maria Machado's experiences in a relationship with another woman, and it sort of discusses her struggles and her it chronicles the timeline of this relationship through a bunch of different narrative tropes, and it's experimental. It's so interesting. I've already started reading it, and she mentions at the very beginning of the novel, if you feel that this novel is for you, it's because it is. So I encourage all of you to get a copy of the novel. I know that you're a student of the Auraria campus, we can provide copies for you through our GITA services, and we also have more on that in our GITA Instagram information. We have flyers available at GITA_MSU Denver if you want to check it out, and I really hope that all of you can come. We would love to have a big group to discuss this really wonderful nonfiction novel with all of you. So yeah.
Thanks, Julissa. Is someone from the scholarship team, would you all be willing to chime in and chat about your event on Friday, whether it's Julissa or Rowan or X if you're here?
I can do that too. So we're also going to be having a FAFSA/CAFSA that was formerly known as DIA, a virtual drop-in assistance event. So we're going to be helping you fill out your financial aid forms. And if you join us on Zoom, we are raffling off a lunch for two. So it really is the perfect way to get everything that you probably need to get done out of the way stress-free, because we're going to be there to help you. And you can also perhaps win a dinner for two. And, if you don't, however you want to go about that, that's, yeah. I don't know if there's anything else I need to say. That's going to be on October 30th from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. So yeah, I hope you join us for that too, because it's really important to get those forms filled out.
Thank you. Next Friday, too, we're launching the first of a number of supply drive, a campus supply drive on campus. So students are able to register to come to campus and pick up a tote bag stuffed full of things that they would normally find in the Gita common space. So things like dried packaged food, pantry items, safer sex products, menstrual support products, and things like that. So we're super excited if you're in need of an extra tote bag of goodies as you finish out October. Please tune in to Gita for more information. Nastasia, Sex Cafe.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nastasia, and I run the Sex Cafe. Every month, we have a discussion, sort of unpacking various aspects of sex and sexuality, as well as gender as it relates to both of those things. So, this month, we're going to be doing a costume and role playing theme. We invite everyone who shows up to come in costume if you're comfortable. Um, and we will be discussing role play, sexual role play, as a tool for unpacking and interrogating normative relationship structures, as well as a tool for exploring fantasy in a non judgmental environment.
Thanks, Nastasia. In addition, next month we will be having 2 advising days. These are virtual drop-in days that will be going on all day long. Student staff at Gita, Soj Saravanchai, Retention and Success Advisor, and Dr. Kent Martinez, Chair of GWS, are all working on these events. Students can drop in during the designated advising days and get support for enrolling in their classes in the spring and other general academic assistance. And then lastly, Phil's gonna share a little bit with you all about the podcast.
Yeah. So Gita Hold of Yourself. Gita, Gita, Hold of Yourself. Is a student-led podcast. We just recently dropped, I believe like 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. And yeah, it's just basically we are discussing various topics with an intersectional lens. And we also have a spin-off, Too Fat, Too Furious, that well, our usual podcast drops Wednesdays, new episodes every other Wednesday, and Too Fat, Too Furious drops every other Friday on the off weeks. So basically, Too Fat, Too Furious is our little spinoff, and they discuss fatness, moving around in the world, being fat, and yeah. So if you have any ideas, please shoot us an email at gitastudent@msudenver.edu. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Phil. So that was a lot of information, right, about our events and programs. And so if you're curious about learning more about what we do at Gita, there are several ways that you can follow along with us. You can join our bi-monthly newsletter by shooting us an email. You can visit us online at msudenver.edu/Gita. There's a media center that's newly launched on our website that has all of our information that we just shared with you. You can also follow us on various social media accounts. So these are sort of the best ways to get to know what we're doing on campus, to spread the word, and to engage with us. And sooner than later, hopefully, we will all get to be back on campus sharing space together. So with that, I'm going to unshare my screen and I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Kat Martinez, Chair of the GWS Department for Gita.
Thanks, Nettie. Thank you all to those of you who are here with us this evening. I am thrilled to be able to present Anahi Dr. Russo for 2 reasons. The first of these reasons is that Dr. Russo just received tenure this year. And typically what we would do to celebrate this success would be to have a gathering and to invite all of you in who could join us into the Gita space. Because of the pandemic, we're unable to do so, but at some point when we get back, I'm sure that we will try again, invite you in for some food and for some community and celebrate the success. And so that's a wonderful accomplishment. Congratulations, Anahi. Very, very excited and excited for you. And the second reason that we are having this celebration is, of course, the book. The book is an accomplishment, as some of you know, that has taken quite some time to work together, and Anahi will be explaining this a lot more in the reading session. But it's no small feat to write a book, and particularly a book that is based on many years of research. And so this is a great thing. I was super excited to be able to read the book. It's the first time that I've had maybe in 6 years to read for pleasure. And so I was thrilled to read from the book and to learn about the shifting landscape of queer relationships in Mexico City. Some of the things that I pulled from it were related to queer friendship and how these friendships are about survival for a lot of queer folks. Also to read about queer spaces and how they oftentimes transcend boundaries, but are also shifting across times. And one of my favorite chapters was on erotic bodies and erotic possibilities. So I hope to hear more about this. We will have a question and answer period afterwards. And then I believe we also have some books to give out. So we'll have a bit of a raffle for those of you who are interested to get a book for yourself and to read for pleasure like I was able to do. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Russo to talk a little bit more about her book.
Thank you, and thank you so much for all of these introductions. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. I'm so happy to be here to celebrate with you the birth or the conclusion of this project that has been in gestation actually for 21 years, and I will tell you why in a moment. So I want to thank Gita, the Gender Institute for Teaching and Advocacy, for organizing this event, and also my chair, Kat Martinez, who had the vision to make space for this. So thank you. I'm also so pleased to have here colleagues, students, family, friends, advisors, and mentors from various institutions where this project went through and was birthed, from when I was a graduate student at Rutgers, later a postdoc at Carleton, at Brandeis, and finally faculty here at MSU Denver. So thank you so much for allowing the time to write. And what an amazing gift really to be able to present the book to you today. So today I will give you an overview of the book and read some excerpts with you. And we will then take the last part of the presentation for some question. So let's get started where it started for you to get situated in terms of how this project has evolved. So the first time I conducted fieldwork in Mexico City was in fact in year 2000 when I was conducting an MA in anthropology at the time. That's already 20 years ago. In the 1990s, the literature on same-sex sexuality in Latin America was mostly preoccupied with how people who were in same-sex relationships in the region identified. So while women who used labels such as lesbiana, de ambiente, bisexual, still went to the grocery store, played loud music in their cars, and watered their plants without incessantly chattering about questions on identity, when I returned in the 2010s to field work, I found that people still water their plants, but also there were new conversations in Mexico City that were going on, and these were particularly in terms of relationships. I have to say that between 2000 and 2010, I actually lived for 7 years in Mexico City, and that was also not the first time that I was there. My mother, who's actually here, is from Mexico City, and I had always cousins, uncles, aunts, and my grandmother who was there. So when I say that discussions on relationships were apparent, this was apparent through public debates on cohabitation laws for all genders in terms of a law that was called Sociedades de Convivencia that people started talking about in the year 2000, but that passed in 2007. Same-sex marriage was also broadly discussed in the press and in LGBT organizations. Also, that was apparent in social media, at kitchen tables. People were talking about these proposals, but also about other topics that related to intimacy, such as polyamory, families of choices, and friendships. So while discussions on same-sex marriage, which was legitimated in 2010 in the city, was the most visible one, what I really came to sense is that individuals were not only discussing same-sex marriage, but rather really re-envisioning the field of intimate relationships. So how are we to re-envision relationships between the relationship models we are traditionally offered is a question that this book ponders on. Does it need to have a seal of the state? How does it affect what we call friendship, what we call family? What and why are the boundaries between these various types of relationships? And how are individuals reconfiguring and negotiating new views and practices on intimacy in this new context in which new models of relationships emerge? So this is an ethnography which builds on data collected mostly between 2009 and 2016 in Mexico City. It has 45 rich in-depth interviews with women born between 1987 and 1945, participating in queer spaces, and stories collected through participant observations and the review of newspapers of record. The book discusses the transformation of intimacy in the lives of 3 generations of women participating in queer spaces in contemporary Mexico City at a moment in which important changes on sexual citizenship occur after the mid-1990s. So Tortilleras Negotiating Intimacy argues that new intimate cartographies are emerging in Mexico City, ultimately redefining the discourses and practices of intimate relationships, gender, and Mexicanidad. In the process, individuals do not only negotiate these new relationships with partners and friends, but also various forms of complicity with transnational discourses on intimacy, the state, and lo Mexicano. So while Mexico City is really at the heart of this project, it's important to mention that this process is not particular to the city or country. Across the continent, similar conversations have been occurring in places such as Uruguay, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, and the United States. So how are we to understand queer lives in Mexico and in Latin America if we begin paying attention to relationships is an important question that this work explores. This book calls attention to a different focus from subject formation to subject relations, which I will discuss in a moment. So how is this book different than others' ethnographies on same-sex sexuality in Mexico and Latin America? Well, by focusing on 3 generations of women who participate in queer spaces, the book provokes a dialogue with decades of research on queer lives in Mexico, which have repetitively focused on masculine bodies, or when focusing on women, the voices of activists or organized lesbians have been at the forefront. So I predominantly did not interview women who were at the forefront of LGBT organizations or government experts or scholars. In the book, I describe some of the interlocutors as, and I'm going to read here this excerpt. The subjects of this book are women who participate in queer spaces known as El Ambiente, which known as El Ambiente. They take part in lesbian groups and organizations who visit the queer cafes, bars, and clubs in Mexico City. Some shy away from these formal, visible queer spaces, but they form part of the intimate networks of friendships that sustain El Ambiente in Mexico City. While I met some of these women almost 2 decades ago at events organized by the lesbian feminist organization El Closet de Sor Juana, I met others through the informal networks of interlocutors' living rooms in the 2010s. So this book also differs as ethnographic studies on same-sex sexuality in Mexico and Latin America have predominantly paid attention to gender and sexual subject formation. In other words, research goals have often focused on identity or self-making. These studies have offered an important critique to Western narratives on sexual object choice. Nonetheless, scholars such as Guillermo Núñez Noriega suggest that scholarship has lacked imagination by predominantly representing same-sex sexuality along the identity practice binary in Mexico and in Latin America. So if sexual identities have been questioned in the academic literature, less attention has been paid to subjects' relations, which in my view have been central to queer politics since 2000 through public debates on marriage, unions, and polyamory. Through a focus on subjects' relations, this book offers differently situated insight into queer Mexico City. Subject relations is a play on words and ideas on subject formation, which was one of Foucault's central projects, and I quote here, to create a history of the different modes by which our culture, human beings, are made subject, end of quote. So by using the term subjects relations, I signal the processes through which cultures produce dominant relationship models particular subjects must abide by. Subjects relations also highlight how in the 2000s and 2010s, the question in Mexico City was not who am I, but borrowing Foucault's words in his later work, Friendship as a Way of Life, what relationships through homosexuality can be established, invented, multiplied, and modulated. So various types of relationships engages with reflections on Latin American feminist scholars such as Norma Mogrovejo in their work on polyamory. Similar discussions have been taking place in public forums across the continent as people question the forms on same-sex relationships which should be legitimated. While relationships do not exclude subjects, reflecting primarily on relationships urges us to pay attention to other aspects of El Ambiente or queer spaces. A focus on relationships connects with recent inquiries in feminist and queer theories on intimacy, which have investigated feelings, affect, the personal and attachments to friends, families, and lovers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the overview of the book before jumping into a chapter. I know that listening on Zoom is a little bit different than kind of an unusual person-to-person context. At the same time, like we're lucky to all be here together. But let me take you a little bit through the overall arching of the book. So in addition to an introduction, the book has 4 chapters, and each chapter explores how intimate practices have changed for women participating in queer spaces in Mexico City. Because of the complexity of this process, I have organized the book thematically exploring different facets of intimacy, namely polyamory, friendships, sex, and the spatiality of intimate community building. So one of the central chapters of the book that captures the spirit of the time is chapter 1. And when I say the time, right, we're thinking of the 2010s more or less, even if there were significant changes from the beginning of the 2010s to the end of this period. Chapter 1 discusses the emergence of discourses and practices related to lesbian polyamory, which would be having openly more than one partner at the same time. So from Sociedades de Convivencia, a civil union law, to the reform on marriage, the representation of the monogamous same-sex couple became more important, which led to the question of if this was the only way to organize relationships. So this chapter thus proposes that through the strategic articulations of embodied practices, polyamory offers a possibility of alternatives, imaginaries of love, eroticisms, relationships, and even the social organization of Latin American societies overall. So I will read here a few portions of this chapter that permit us to grasp a little bit more what happens in that part of the book. So at the very beginning of the chapter opens with someone saying, "Híjole, this is a very difficult question that I have asked myself multiple times in my relationships," said a young woman at the book launch of a publication on Latin American lesbians' experiences of polyamory, open relationships, and casual sex. "Can I really love multiple people at the same time?" continued the woman at the microphone. Several people in the room smiled at the question, while others seemed to ponder it. The reading took place at Voces en Tinta, a bookstore in Mexico City that specializes in gender and LGBTQI studies. The authors questioned the teleology of amorous relationships that lead to marriage and the family, as well as the social and cultural norms that, in their most conservative expression, align women's sexuality with procreation. It is no surprise that such a reflection would grow at a moment when debates on same-sex partnership and marriage circulated in the public sphere. A little bit further in the chapter, I say, while the book Desobedientes mentioned above resists providing one single definition of polyamory, Espinosa Miñoso suggests that, and I quote, "polyamory, open relationships, free love, and casual sex have been different ways to name the multiple ways of encountering desire, loving relationships, sexuality, and eroticism between human beings out of the social norms of monogamy." So discussions on polyamory were not only taking place in the nascent literature on this topic, but also were noticeable through workshops happening in lesbian spaces. For example, in 2009, 3 organizations, Colectivo Poliamor, Lunas Lesbianas Feministas, and Producciones y Milagros Agrupación Feminista, organized a workshop at the cafe Ellas Nosotras. The invitation on the cafe's website announced that the workshop explored questions such as, and I quote, "Do we establish egalitarian relationships with our partners? Do we recognize our partner as free and autonomous person? How do we live love as a prison or freedom? Is it possible to love more than one person at a time and to live honestly this experience?" So groups such as Colectivo Poliamor that were not necessarily specifically geared to same-sex couples were beginning to work on polyamory in Mexico City. Some of the members of the lesbian university group GLUE also had initiated an online discussion group on polyamory through social media, such as Facebook. This is 2010, so there wasn't as much social media platforms as now. These strategies promoted reflections on an issue that had been frequently demonized in lesbian communities. This is particularly true in a context where discourses on double morality, so classifying women as good or bad according to their sexual behavior, remains present at time. By 2019, so last year, polyamory had come under public attention beyond the queer community. Poliamor's Mexico webpage reported 21 active groups in the country. One of the best well-known mixed gender and sexual orientation groups, Poliamor Valle de Mexico, counted 1,800 members in 2019 on their Facebook page, and the feminist polyamorous group Otres Poliamores counted 468 members the same year. Mainstream media such as the newspapers Milenio and the broad distribution magazine Chilango ran stories on polyamory in 2018, showing the extent to which polyamory had entered mainstream conversations in Mexico. So at a moment in which same-sex committed relations were being legitimated by the state, polyamorous collectives brought to our attention the possibility of organizing intimacy differently. As mentioned, polyamorous relationships were not in themselves new, However, the increasing proliferation of discourses on polyamory certainly came along with the theorization of these practices. It is important to question why polyamorous relationships were theorized in Mexico and across Latin America at that time. When do collectives and movements sense the need to theorize intimate relationships? So while some of the strategies were discursive, such as workshops, books, etc., the heart of the strategy resides in the alternative embodied practices that are not always fully legitimated in the lesbian world or in larger society. It rests on a series of disorganized actions that signal a fissure in the normative tissue. Actions are largely unplanned, as the book Desobedientes that is mentioned above mentions, and other cultural productions emerged as a reflection on the apparent spontaneity and disorganization of desire. Books such as Desobedientes indirectly present the strategy as an open question that has no single answer. Precisely, the strategy attacks the single root of compulsive coupling and reproduction while suggesting that there are many answers as people in relationships on how to live effective relationships. For the most part, Desobedientes and other cultural productions do not promise that polyamory will lead to utopia, nor do they suggest that the execution of the strategy is without difficulties. As Espinosa Miñoso reflects in the introduction of that book, it is true that the path is not full of roses. The path of open relationships is certainly not the easiest one. And Espinosa Miñoso says, but the challenge is there for all of us. After all, the path of lesbianism has not been easy, and yet I have found satisfaction in it. And I was reading a quote. So Espinosa Miñoso invites readers on a route filled with hope and despair all at once. So I'm gonna, I don't wanna hold you too long with this part, and I would like to go soon to the question period, but I'm gonna share with you some of the parts of the chapter where some of the people I interviewed shared their views on these new ideas that were present in Mexico City in terms of intimate relationships. So during interviews, interlocutors discussed how they negotiated new narratives on polyamory that were circulating in El Ambiente. However, it is important to remark that although publications theorized polyamory, only a few interlocutors had ever been in polyamorous relationships, whether they call it as such or not. And if you're interested about how they navigate also new discourses on marriage, there's a new article in Science that just came out this month where they grapple with the question of marriage and polyamory as well, which I'm the author of. So while marriage was an option, to my knowledge, only one interlocutor formally married after the reform passed. Similarly, as polyamory was becoming an option, interlocutors discussed the possibility of it, but did not necessarily engage in it. So for this reason, ideas on polyamory as a new relationship option are as important as the practice of it itself. In some cases, individuals were fully aware of the polyamorous proposal and were actively considering what it meant in their lives. So for example, Selene, who was a history student at the National University at UNAM, shared during the interview her views on polyamory. And she said, I do consider that I'm loving, that I love many people at the same time. Right now, I love my friends, I love my mother, I love my father, my brothers, my grandmother, my nephew. And this, in a way, is polyamory. Like we practice it without even knowing about it. In sexual terms, I have talked about it with Diana. It would be hard for her, but she's open to the idea of me experimenting with other people. And it's a thing that really scares me, that I cannot just do like this. So in this quote, Selene first clarifies her definition of polyamory, which involves the term love beyond the confines of romantic love and or sexual bonds. Discussions of polyamory had split open the meaning of love to question not only romantic love, but also friendship, familial love, and other forms of affection. The study of various relationships between women signals to Adrian's rich notion of a lesbian continuum. This continuum includes sex between women among relationship modalities, but also non-sexual interactions such as, and I quote, sharing of a rich inner life, bonding against male tyranny, the giving and receiving of practical and political support, end of quote. So Aldo Rich writes in Dialogue with the 1980s Social and Political Dilemmas in the US, the notion of a continuum is useful here since it signals the difficulties of locking apart interactions into a precise kind of relationship. So I found this reflection on different kinds of love to be common, particularly among younger women I interviewed. So a little bit further, also trying to grasp what people were telling me about polyamory, I talk about how it was difficult to affirm that there were no cultural repertoires to situate how interlocutors associated. I think there's something missing here, but basically it was difficult to affirm that there were no cultural repertoires to measure polyamory by. Some interlocutors associated its practitioners with existing subject positions that relate to the notion of double morality in Mexico City. So Arribazivi, Amushastegui, Carrillo, and Hirsch have found in their respective ethnographic research in Mexico, the notion of double morality implies that decent women should be sexually passive and tie sexuality to procreation and marriage, compared with bad women who actively engage with sexuality regardless of marital status. So double morality has been challenged by a proliferation of contemporary discourses on sexuality, and some recent ethnographic research suggests that the notion is far less present or non-existent among younger generations in Mexico City. The question of double morality was still tackled, however, in the public sphere, indicating that it had not fully vanished. So in 2011, people walked down the streets of Mexico City for La Marcha de las Putas, the Slut Walk, a global initiative. And this was continuing, and further in the book, I talk about it also happening in 2018 in Puebla. Marta Lamas, an anthropologist who participated in the Marcha in 2011, said that La Marcha was important because, and I quote, it's a struggle for a symbolic redefinition which does not only end with the ideological separation between decent women and putas, which means sluts, but it does provoke a very necessary reflection in relation to double morality, end of quote. So polyamory was consequently often evaluated through the notion of double morality. And so, for example, when I asked Deborah, who was born in 1978 and was a beauty parlor receptionist at the time, about her thoughts on polyamory, she first said she had only a vague idea about it. Reflecting a little longer, she next suggested, pues yo creo que después de que terminé con esta persona, yo estuve actuando, o mi filosofía ya era así, porque juré y juré que nunca me voy a volver a enamorar. So I think that after I ended my relationship with that person, I acted like that, or that became my philosophy, because I promised myself I would never fall in love again. So after a deep heartbreak, Deborah had erotic encounters with men and women, making clear to her lovers that she was not looking for a relationship. Deborah described her understanding of polyamory further as el poliamor sería estar con uno y otro, sería mujeriego. Polyamory would be like being with one and then another one, like womanizer. And then she laughed. Deborah associates the polyamorous practitioner with the mujeriego, a common subject position that is traditionally associated with men who pursue many women. In stating that it became her philosophy at a point in her life, she temporarily took the subject position of the mujeriego, which triggered great joyful laughter in her. Although Deborah was a feminine looking beauty parlor receptionist at the time, she met many women, I would suggest that labeling herself as a womanizer, a masculine subject position, redeems her from being judged through the notion of double morality. So I'm gonna go towards what is at the end of the chapter and talk a little bit about an organization of lesbian mothers that was called Red de Madres Lesbianas en Mexico, and how they were grappling with new notions that were appearing in the context around polyamory, marriage, and these ideas that were circulating at the time. So in the summer of 2014, I had the opportunity to attend a meeting of the Red de Madres Lesbianas en Mexico, a network of lesbian mothers. The network counts approximately 600 mothers virtually, but a pool of about 30 mothers attend the face-to-face meetings. And I'm gonna share here, if I have sharing screen privileges, my screen for a moment to show you a poster that I'm briefly. Oh, okay, I can't share my screen. I will show you in the book if it's visible. Oh, okay, I'm the host now, so I can share my screen. Okay, so we see here, this is actually a poster that the Red de Madres Lesbianas put together. And this is a manual for K-12 education teachers. This was part of a campaign that circulated in the Mexico City subway system, particularly the poster that we have here. And this was basically, if you went to work in bus or taking the subway, this would have been what you would have seen during your commute. The poster said, una mamá, dos mamás, tres mamás. All families are equal, visible lesbian motherhoods. So this poster basically, I think, captures a little bit the different discourses that were available for people to think about, but also organizations and to consider, and shows the ways in which this idea of polyamory had imbued the ways in which people think about intimacy in terms of relationships and so on. If you notice, right, there's a little bit of a discrepancy in terms of the poster and the titles. We don't see one mother or we don't see three mothers. So there's a question here also of what can be presented in public and what can be said and not. So it's half said. The poster, importantly, was put together by Red de Madres Lesbianas en Mexico, but was also sponsored by the Mexico City government. So in a way, right, we have here a gesturing towards some forms of normativity that relate to the reproductive family, and in the image, at least, coupling. But in other ways, we have some forms of transgression in using 1, 2, 3 mothers. But the transgression is also reabsorbed by the way that it's sponsored by the Mexico City government. There was something else that I wanted to say about this poster. Yeah, so this poster really shows in some ways how organizations were thinking about it. When I asked one of the main organizers of the group why she chose that title, she talked about how 3 mothers could be a couple, and one of them had another partner. It could be a couple that had ended a relationship and one of them was in a new relationship. But also the organizer said, when I was at that meeting, you see these 2 women and this other woman that is next to them. The third woman is their niece, and their niece actually helps taking care of the nephew. So in reality, there are 3 mothers. So they were not only thinking about romantic or sexual relationships in that sense. So I'm gonna leave it at that, I think, because I've been talking for a little bit. And yeah, so I would be really happy to take questions, and I hope that was useful.
Thank you, Anahi. And if you do have questions, there are a couple ways that you can ask them. You can simply unmute yourself and ask. There's a raise hand tool that you may press, and I'll check on the sidebar to make sure that your name is called, or you can post a question in the chat function and we'll go ahead and make sure that Anahi receives those as well. One question from the group is if you would please explain interlocutors and what that means.
Yeah, interlocutors are the people you talk with during your fieldwork research. So in the past, in the social sciences, people used to use terms such as informants, which sounds like a form of surveillance in some way. And maybe it makes sense that was the term when we think about sort of the ways in which this is related to sort of colonial enterprises when we look at the history, for example, of anthropology and ethnography and so on. But interlocutors are basically the people with who you're talking during fieldwork, and the people that I was asking questions and what do you think about this term polyamory, how does that fit in your life and so on, and who reply to you basically.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah, hi Lorena.
Hi, sorry I'm driving, so I can't be on screen, but thank you so much. What an interesting presentation, and congratulations. What a major accomplishment in getting tenure and publishing a wonderful book. So I'm wondering, and I may have missed some of this because I was out and about doing my shopping while doing this. I'm sorry, cobbling together things. But I really appreciate this expanded notion of the family, of how polyamory is viewed as like not just, intimate sexual partners, but also, could be your grandmother, your, niece, or, other family, extended family. And I'm wondering if that's done, like to expand the terminology of polyamory in a way to, both in a way to transgress, but also to make this more expansive version of including families to include LGBTQ, plus folks to be more acceptable in Latinx culture. And if you could just talk a little bit more about that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm thinking about some of the books that circulate on polyamory that are often more about polynormativities, right? That gives you a prescription of how to engage in polyamory and what is the recipe for a successful polyamorous relationship. And what I was finding is that on one side, there was some of that literature that was circulating, also more kind of critical perspectives, such as in the collection Desobedientes that I was mentioning earlier. But when I was asking people about their views on polyamory, their responses were pretty different actually from what was out there published. And as one of the interlocutors says, she says that when she hears the term polyamory, right, she thinks about multiple forms of amory or multiple forms of love. And that does not have necessarily to include romantic or sexual relationships. And I think that's also really interesting in a Latin American context, right? Like we're sort of this idea of the family, and in Mexico City where it's pretty expensive to live by yourself and so on. It's pretty common to live in an extended family pattern. So I think that there's some kind of critical thinking to do there in terms of how that term polyamory travels, right? Through different communities, through different borders. And so, yeah, thank you so much for your question.
And we have a couple of questions in the chat here. Several people have asked questions about Sor Juana and why that name. It looks like several people recognize the name and have done some reading. And so that's the first question. And then a second question is about changes in intimacy around the 1990s. If you could explain what the shifts consist of and what may explain these shifts.
Yeah, thank you. So Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is a nun who was in Mexico in the 1500s, and she's known as a poetess. And maybe you happen to have read some of her work. And she's a very important Mexican figure. So if you say Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, most people will know who she is. But there is sort of a rumor that she had an affair with the Bisreina, which is the person who represents the queen in Mexico during colonial times. And so there are some lesbian organizations who have kind of reclaimed her image. And El Closet de Sor Juana is an example of that, which is an lesbian feminist organization in Mexico City that has been there since the 1990s. And so, so that's the reason why some organizations reclaim her persona, we could say. And about the 1990s shift, we see in the 1990s, the beginning of changes that become more apparent in the 2000s. So in the 1990s, we see, at least at the legal level, some changes in Mexico City. So you have an anti-discrimination law that includes sexual orientation, among other categories, that enters in effect in 1999, which means that the conversations were going on a little bit earlier. And then in the 2000s, we have also a shift from these anti-discrimination laws question to these questions that relate more to unions, to marriage, being sort of at the center of Mexico City's organizations, activities that we're thinking of. Now, importantly, this, if you think about that chronology, that's not so far, right, from what was happening here in the US, or if you're familiar with other Latin American countries, in other countries as well. So this is more of a transcontinental shift, really, when you start thinking about it beyond the borders of Mexico. And in fact, when I was talking to activists, they were often talking about how they were in conversation with other activists in other countries. So it would be important to think about these shifts, not only in the context of Mexico, but more in a, I'm not sure that I can say in a global way, because if you look at other continents, these conversations were not necessarily going on. And that was pretty apparent to me when I was participating in a network called the Ariane a couple of years ago, where in other parts of the world, that was not the main conversation going on, but across the Americas, for sure.
Is it okay if I ask a question first? Yeah. Okay. Hola, Anahi. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Really looking forward to your book, and congrats on tenure. Pretty amazing. So I think you just touched a little bit on my question about transnational concepts of intimacy. So, you know, we don't have to repeat that, but I was curious about that negotiation. And specifically when you talked about the, I guess, rearranging or negotiating new ways of understanding amorous relationships or connections that are outside of teleological understandings of them. And I'm curious how that played out with the interlocutors and in your own analysis. I'm really curious always about alternative ways of being, thinking, knowing. And so if it's outside of those normatives, then how did that come about? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so the teleological ways of understanding, I'm thinking also about, it was not so discussed a couple of years ago in the literature on polyamories, but now there is a lot of talk around the relationship escalator, so that you first have to invite the person on a date, and then you date for a while, and after 2 years you ask them to move in, and after you ask them to marry, and so on, and that there's a particular kind of escalator. And it seems to me that one of the questions that was on the table was like, is that really the kind of teleology that we want to see if it ends up in marriage, right? I really think that it's not necessarily a direct causality, but it's an unintended consequence under conversations on same-sex marriage, that at that time people began talking about questions such as polyamory, open relationships, questioning in a way, what are the ways in which we can live our relationships that do not necessarily look only as the model that has been presented to us? What about I don't know, being single? What about having circles of friendship? So I think that polyamory and marriage are just the tip of the iceberg that make the conversation recognizable. But around that, there are all sort of, as you're saying, possibilities, alternatives that that I think can be done in some form of thick description and ethnography. But when we start boxing them, unless it's a really prominent trend, then we sort of lose a little bit that idea of alternative and possibilities. I'm thinking. Thank you so much, La.
We have a couple more questions in the chat. One of these is, did you come across any references or frameworks that viewed polyamory from an indigenous lens? The second one from the same person is regarding the flyer you showed. How did the government fund the event? Was it a grant?
Yeah, about the funding, I'm not sure, but it was actually put together by the Mexico City government. They are responsible for selecting the publicity that goes into the subway system and the bus system, the transportation system, basically. And so it was not sponsored as a grant. It was basically directly sponsored by Mexico City government, sort of as part of one of their projects. If they have to do a report of the projects of the year, that project would be part of it, that campaign. And in terms of indigenous lenses of polyamory, it was not really on the table of the discussion. If you look at some of the anthologies that come at the time, Desobedientes, or one that comes later in 2017 on Contra Amores, there's not so much of and that's written actually by people in different countries. There's contributions for people in Mexico, but also from people who are located in Argentina, in Brazil, Latinx people in the US. So you have sort of a transcontinental perspective, but as far as I'm aware of, no engagement with an indigenous lens of it. Some people and some of the main authors or editors of that collection give more an Afro-Caribbean lens actually to polyamory, but not indigenous necessarily in that transcontinental perspective, which would be definitely something to look into.
And then we have a request as well here. If you could speak a little bit more about navigating the various relationships and positionalities between you as a researcher and subjects, where there were friendships and other networks of community that involved you. And there was one right before this. I'm gonna ask that Nastasia ask you directly about the one right before this, but methodology, how creating community offers opportunities and or obstacles in the ethnographic process. Did you find you had access to more or richer information in some areas?
Yeah, the question about researchers and friendships and so on, it's complicated. One, I lived in that period for 8 years in Mexico City. So the boundaries between field work and sort of everyday life, although I was not conducting field work for most of that time, can be tenuous, right? Like in those years that I was in Mexico City, working actually for the Mexico City government in Mujeres that was behind the poster, although I was not working there anymore at the time, and also an NGO a little bit later. You know, I continued my friendships. I continued going to different places or events that were there. And so there are for sure, right, boundaries that can be there in terms of who you interview and the ways in which you get to know this person. But at the same time, I think like in such a process where you live so close to the place, at times the boundaries can be tenuous, right? And I talk a little bit about that in the introduction, about what are the implications for research in that sense, and how people I had known sometimes for, at that time, maybe 10, 15 years, right, I did not necessarily take notes of everything that they would tell me, but at the same time, they were the first one because they really knew about my life and what I was doing to tell me, hey, you should write about that for your research. And also they were the people that I could go to and ask, hey, I've noticed this pattern. What do you think about that? And so there were interlocutors that were in a way closer and with whom kind of we wore different hats. And there were some interlocutors that I interviewed for 2 hours and then I didn't interact with after. So there's really a range in that sense, but also an important critical form of thinking in the ways in which we produce knowledge, right? And in terms of the methodologies and the communities, I think the community changed a lot. I said at the beginning that the first time I did ethnography in Mexico City was in year 2000. At that time, the community used to be pretty small, and it was not rare that you would arrive to an event and you would say, oh, I was just hanging out with this person. And they would say, oh, is that the ex of so-and-so and the friend of so-and-so? And everyone was aware a little bit of the community, which was not necessarily the case in definitely like in the past couple of years. And not that Pride is a marker, but some of the official numbers now talk about Pride March as 500,000 people in Mexico City, and that goes on for hours and hours. So it's not the official marker. Many people can participate there, but it's the extent and the boundaries of the community have become much more abstract in some ways. And in other ways, it has become visible when we think about the city. And I talk a little bit about that in chapter 4 of the book, that there are parts of the city like the Zona Rosa that are queer identified because of the flags and the restaurants that cater to a queer clientele, and often sort of in a spirit of commodification, right, as well. The community has changed a lot, and I think that it implicates different research methods, which was to go to different groups that cater to different age groups that kind of, and then kind of snowball sampling also with people of different ages.
Thanks for your answer, Anahi. And for the second question, I just wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about what you have perceived as the constructive and potentially destructive impacts on like the normalization, or from the normalization of polyamory in societies. You talked about the ad campaign. And I know that there's a lot of discourse out there about watering down through ad campaigns or other normalizing media when it comes to queer communities. So I was just wondering, if you could speak on some of the phenomena, and like if you've perceived any or observed any outcomes that are positive or negative.
Yeah, I think at the time that I was doing research, it was something that was beginning to be discussed, and it was not necessarily something that had been normalized yet in the queer community, like in many parts of the queer community or kind of at large. But as the decades moves forward, we see, such as the ad that I presented, right, that was sponsored by the Mexico City government. We see this also being present in newspapers, articles that are for the mainstream and so on. I'm not sure, and that would require more research, but I'm not sure that it has been like completely normalized. I find that like often the reports and so on are kind of seen more as a curiosity and something to be presented as like different way of life and so on. So that's what comes to mind, and especially when there's particular recipes around polynormativities, I think that complicates the question, because then the potential for alternatives and so on is watered down, I would say.
One other question here, and a thank you for your very rich talk, is do you have insights about processes of subjects formations today? What continuing or emerging relationships are affecting or transforming intimacies in the current moment?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, kind of using, and yesterday I was talking about how this is probably a part of the book that is transferable to other contexts, right? So there are things that are very specific to Mexico City, but that's one of the notions that I think can transfer to other contexts in terms of the ways in which particular societies produce certain relationship modalities, right? And so I think like that, if I was to, if someone was to continue this research, a lot of what I do is looking at the ways in which people engage discourses, but I think it would be about looking in practice what it looks like, right? So it's almost as if the theory, the discourse is kind of the theory, and then like the practice might look very different. And that might, in a way, give us some information between the discrepancy of the practice of particular relationship models that are handed to us, and right, like sort of the ideal model that we have. So I know that I'm not exactly answering your question. I don't have a concrete example, but I'm thinking that this is where it's taking us next.
And I do have a question. I know this was a smaller piece of your book, but I was really sort of drawn by this idea of friendship as betrayal, which seemed to be a common comment that mothers would make to their daughters about you need to be at home and not building these relationships outside of the home. Can you speak a little bit more about that and how that sort of relates to I think the overall theme of that, and it could be related to double morality as well.
Yeah, I think that in that part of the book, I talk about how for a lot of the women who were talking to me about their lives, there was sort of this idea you should spend more time at home and less with your friends. And your primary mode of affection should be towards your family and spending time with your family. And this, in a way, lays sort of the ground to talk about how, in reality, female friendships would be transgressive in themselves, right? Because the message was people, in a way, accepted, right, kind of friends and so on. And on one hand, people were encouraged to pursue friendships, but in another hand, it was, that's fine, but you have to prioritize your family. And so yeah, so in that sense, it lays the ground for that view of friendship between women.
Which also sort of relates to that queer friendship as survivorship as well, correct?
Yeah, yes. And so some people talked about friendships as a way of survival or as a world, right, that they were co-constructing with their friends, and that gave the potential to look at the world through, in that part of the book, through a lesbian lens that looked pretty different from the ideas that were shared on gender and sexualities in their immediate families, communities, and so on. So these worlds of friendship, in a way, were a possibility for thinking about the world from a different standpoint. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think we
are
yeah,
about at time. Are there any final questions? I know that there were a lot of congratulations in the chat. I don't know if Anahi, if you've been able to see those, but we can go ahead and save them for you to be able to see later on. If anyone has any final comments, now would be the time. right. Thank you all very much for being with us this evening and for helping us to celebrate both Dr. Russo's tenure. Sorry, I spaced that out. The tenure, as well as the publication of this wonderful book. Nettie, correct me if I'm wrong, how are we going to do the book giveaway? We're going to do a book.
Yeah, so we have about roughly 10 copies to give out to students of Auraria. So what we're going to do is pull a list on everyone who's attended, and we're going to do a drawing for the students from that crew. So I apologize to the non-students of Auraria, but for the students of Auraria, if your name is chosen for the remaining copies, expect to receive an email from us in the next couple days or so. And thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm so glad to have shared this with you, and thank you so much for being here. Yeah, it means a lot. Thank you.
Have a good evening, everybody. And again, once we are able to join together as a community again, we'll invite as many folks as can be with us back to celebrate. All right. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just thinking in case there was like any final comment, but I think that's about it.
Yeah, I mean, you're welcome to stick around if you want to talk to anybody who's left in here. I see Arlene has taken.
Yeah, my parents are here.
Sorry about that crazy light situation. I just love the book, Anahi. It was so, I felt like I got to know all the individuals in the book. And I just got so concerned about what's happening during COVID. Like, how are they connecting? How do you intimacy? Just these aren't just acquaintances, but they're deep friendships.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if you're in touch still.
Yeah, with some people, like, and I think the people who actually I've been the most in touch are the people who are the most affected. Like, I have a friend who has gone through multiple operations, so she can't really get out. And so it's, affecting her in a particular way. And Mexico is also not doing so well in terms of how it's handling the pandemic, apparently. And I think like now people have kind of resumed like a little bit like in many parts of the US to kind of going to places and those who can't kind of staying at home. But there was a moment for sure, like, that when everyone was kind of texting everyone kind of, hey, are you okay? And all of that, like I was in connection with many people in Mexico and and kind of who were struggling, and people who kind of had to lose their jobs and businesses. So something similar a little bit to here, but with a lot of people kind of living more in extended family patterns too. So it kind of has a different effect too if one person can keep their job.
Are they building Zoom communities like what's happening in some places in the US?
I'm not sure in terms of the organizations. Like, I haven't really kind of looked at if people are meeting online or all of that. And it's actually possible because some of the organizations were meeting every 3 weeks. And they were more kind of social gathering spaces. But then there's the question, right? If your family doesn't know or is not okay with it, like, is it as easy to meet on Zoom or And do they have connectivity too? Because there's a little bit less kind of widespread of the internet. Some people kind of use their phone, go to the internet cafe, so on.
Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, thank you so much for reading the book. And yeah.
Oh my gosh, like Kat, it was like, oh, what am I doing this weekend? I can't write, you know. And yeah, it was just, and again, it was you you really connected with your, I don't want to call them subject, but you know, your friends
Yeah.
and relationships, and just a joy, just such, and congratulations on tenure.
Thank you. Yeah, you should, I'll meet my mom, who's right there, who's,
oh, hey.
Yeah, and then my dad is there too, but I don't see him. Oh, I think you're on mute. You're well. Oh,
hello.
And that's my dad.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah.
Nice to see
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for attending and for the support and to organize this. Yeah, thanks, Kat. That was.
Congratulations. I'm sorry I missed most of it. I got hung up with a nurse and my mom, and I just did you read from the book?
Yeah, a little bit. I just presented more an overview, and then at the end a little bit of reading.
It wasn't recorded, was it?
I think it was. Yeah.
Oh, yay. Okay.
Yeah.
I can watch it in solitude. Which won't be as fun, but at least I get to hear it.
Yeah.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
I think you're host, so if you'd like a little bit of time with your parents, I'm going to go ahead and drop out, and you're welcome to stay on, I believe, as long as you want to.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kat.
Thank you. Good to meet you all.
It's nice seeing your parents again. I remember meeting them in
that's
the office years ago when you were visiting. So good to see you.
Yes, I remember.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Nice for us too.
Bueno, pues hablamos mañana.
Ok, mi chiquilina, feliz. ¿Estás contenta?
Sí,
Bien,
contenta. Sí.
Felicidades, bravo.
Gracias. Ok.
Nos hablamos mañana.
Bye.